Today, I would like to share a story about um, a man who I really didn't know much about. But let me begin with this. The spirit of hope buries itself in the minds of souls of the enslaved. It gave them that determination to survive and even thrive under the most horrific of circumstances. The spirit of hope sank its roots deep into the very moral fabric of those who were enslaved and emboldened them with the will to live no matter what. They sought a better future. If not them, then their children. If not their children, then their children's children. The spirit of hope burns bright and glows in the darkest of places, in the most desperate of times, and in the most hopeless situations. Thousands of enslaved people would struggle in the spirit of hope that a time of reckoning would settle upon their unfathomable existence. For them, the spirit of hope could never be extinguished. From the Missouri slave narratives emerges a little-known story of Spottswood Rice, as told by his daughter, Mary Bell. It had been 72 years since the end of slavery and the Civil War. It was August 1937, and Mary Bell was 85 years old. She was interviewed as part of a federal writers' project to record her life during slavery and the Civil War. She was described as having a very fair complexion, light brown eyes, and long, straight gray hair. Mary showed her age. Her body was bent over, and she wore that distinct mantle of grueling labor of enslavement. Oh, she was pleasant and spoke at ease. She was born May 1st, 1852. Mary, her 5 siblings, and her mother, Ori Ferguson, were owned by the Spencer, Miss Kitty Diggs, and her brother, F.W. Diggs. Mary Bell said, "Slavery was a mighty hard life." At age 7, she was hired out to be a nursemaid for 3 children. She was there for 1 year. After that, she was hired out again to nurse 3 more children. Not only did she care for the children, but there she worked in the kitchen, fed the chickens, gathered eggs, fetched wood and water. Her work days were endless. By the time Mary would lay her head down, she was exhausted. She worked there for 2 years and stated that neither family treated her very well. Mary said her life was hard. Each day was a struggle, but she felt her parents' lives were much harder. Even as a young child, she could see and feel their pain and anguish. Her parents had a slave marriage. Her father lived on one plantation where tobacco was grown. Her father's name was Spottswood Rice. He was owned by a Mr. Benjamin Lewis. Spottswood was the head slave in charge of curing and twisting and rolling the tobacco leaves. Mr. Lewis's son had probably grown up with Spottswood, and so he taught him to read and write, much to the displeasure and annoyance of his father. Although Spottswood was of value for his tobacco skills, he was often beaten. Mr. Lewis was extremely cruel master. Now, Spottswood was allowed to visit his family twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays, and often when he arrived, he was all bloody from the beatings. His wife would very patiently wash and iron his clothes and tend to his wounds. Spot started talking about running away. He had run away before, But this time, he talked and talked about it so much that it frightened his wife, and she begged and pleaded for him not to do this. But he said the beatings were more frequent, and they were for the slightest infractions, for even perceived infractions. Finally, he had enough, and he ran away. Spottswood hid in the woods, under houses, wherever he could for 3 days, and he watched the paddy rollers. They were everywhere. Finally, he decided there was no way he was going to escape. So he turned himself in to a Negro slave trader that he knew. He asked him to buy him from his master. But of course, his master wouldn't sell him, said he was much too valuable. Spottswood, with the determination, said to his master, if the beatings continue, I will run away. I will continue to run away until I'm either free or dead. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation was published January 1st, 1863, and Spottswood read it in the newspaper. He then, in turn, read it to all the slaves on the plantations. Now they knew freedom was at hand, freedom was coming, and so they were less cooperative in the fields. Their work slowed down, and no amount of threats or beatings could make them more compliant. In desperation, his master said to him, when freedom comes, if you will stay, I will give you land on this plantation. I will help you build a house, and I want you to convince the other slaves not to leave. Spottswood listened as his master talked on, and finally he said, I will do that. But he thought to himself, he has no redeeming qualities. He will say anything to keep us here, but in the end, he will break his promise. He stayed 6 months, and after that, he escaped with 11 other slaves, and they made it as far as Glasgow, Missouri, where they joined the Union Army. They were stationed in Kansas City and then moved to Benton Barracks near St. Louis. While he was there, Spottswood became ill and was hospitalized. When he was there, he began thinking more and more about his family in bondage. And there he wrote 2 very descriptive letters, one to his daughters and the other to Miss Kitty Diggs. He spoke of her character and asked her, as a Christian, how could she justify holding his family in bondage when he was fighting for freedom? So outraged was Miss Kitty's brother that he wrote to the commander of the Missouri Department demanding that Spottswood be transferred, and then said his sister was a loyal Union member and she should be able to keep her slaves. Spottswood was not transferred, and he spent most of his time in St. Louis. We can only surmise the kinds of things he did there. He probably drilled twice a day. He learned to handle and fire a musket rifle. He supported artillery battery. He served his guard duty. And finally, he took on nursing duties. These are some of the things that he might have done. He was mustered out of the service in May of 1865 and decided to remain in St. Louis. He became a nurse at Benton Barracks. He was reunited with his family, and his children, for the very first time, went to school. Later, his children would attend one of the many church schools that were set up for former slave children. In 1874, Spottswood's occupation changed. He was an ordained elder in the AME church. And in the 1880 census, he said he was a minister. By 1881, he was the minister of the St. Paul Chapel in North St. Louis. It is still currently open. By 1882, he began to be transferred all over Missouri. He was at the State Line Church in Kansas City. The Reverend Rice was very successful in his ministry and very efficient at building churches for his congregation. The Reverend Rice would spend many a day in many different churches in both Missouri and Kansas. In 1880, he moved west to New Mexico, where he founded the first church, AME Church, in the state of New Mexico. Sadly, in 1888, his wife died, Ori Ferguson. The Reverend Rice would remarry a year later. By 1890, he and his new wife, Eliza, they were transferred to Colorado. The Reverend Rice was aging and his health was deteriorating, but he worked diligently in the church. Because of his illnesses, he was able to get a Civil War pension. In Colorado, he founded another church called the Payne Chapel. It is still functioning today. In October 31st, 1907, the Reverend Spottswood Rice died at age 88. His obituary stated that he had been a chaplain in the Army. However, it is unknown whether or not this was an honorary position or an official position. Spottswood Rice lived an amazing and resilient life. He was born enslaved, fought in the Civil War, was very religious, and loved his family deeply. A remarkable life lived. And what of his daughter, Mary Bell? We gleaned this story from her interview. She was one of the daughters that he wrote the letter to. She was freed January 11th, 1865. She was 13 years old and her family was reunited near Benton Barracks. Her father was a nurse there. Her mother took in washing, and when she was not going to school, she helped with the laundry. Although Mary went to many different schools, she said she was very apt at learning. She married at age 22 and had 7 children. However, only 2 are alive now. Her married daughter lives in the same yard next door, and her son is in the Philippine Islands. He is in the Army. She had 8 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. Mary's husband died in 1896, and she was a widow, has been a widow ever since. Several years ago, she bought a 4-room house. It took her 6 years to pay it off, and she was proud of that. She was a member of the St. Paul AME Church in North St. Louis. In closing, Mary said this: I love Army men. My father, my brother, my husband, and my son were all Army men, and I truly love them. I love a man who will fight for his rights and any person that wants to be something. Mary Bell, a life well lived. Thank you.